So, to summarize the short story, pretty much it follows this person named Jackson, and he's from the Spokane Reservation, and he went to college in Seattle, and he dropped out very quickly. He worked some blue-collar jobs, and then he kind of found himself to be homeless, but because he can kind of get by with people and can make friendships, he ends up doing pretty okay and kind of enjoys the way that he lives. And he's with two other people, a person named Sharon and a person named Junior. And one of the days they're walking around in Seattle, and they see a pawn shop, and what seems to be his grandmother's regalia. And sure enough, when they go in there, a yellow kind of stitch is hidden under the armpit of the regalia. And the clerk says, "Hey, if you can get enough money for this, I will give it back to you, because I believe your story." And then the rest of the story kind of follows the experience that he has, is the way he kind of tries to get money, and just what he does to be able to get the regalia back. And then he ends up doing it in the end. And that's kind of what the story follows, and that's what the story is about. The next question asks is whether the main character is justified in getting the regalia back. And from just reading the story and just kind of seeing the time frames and everything that happened, I would say that he's just not justified in getting it. And I think for one reason is that it wasn't his to begin with. It was his grandmother's. And since it was stolen, we don't know if, she was going to give it to his family after, if maybe she was going to sell it, or we really don't know what would have happened. So it wasn't his to begin with. But I also think another problem would be is in the story, it kind of highlights the drinking problem that he has, and he's blacked out many times. And, maybe that might have affected his memory and his understanding, and maybe he doesn't exactly know everything. And I don't think you can maybe trust a story like that, and especially after so many years and so many events and so many people he met. I don't think it's maybe possible to kind of have even a complete story after such a long time. And so I think in that way he's not exactly justified in wanting the regalia back. The next question asks if the clerk was obligated to give him the regalia back. And I don't think he was obligated. I think when you obligate someone, you force them to, you kind of make them to. And we see that it was the clerk's shop. He owned it. And if he wanted to give it to him, or if he didn't, he had, I guess, every right to. But one example in particular is when he does decide to give it to him, even though he gave him way less than what he asked for, was, Jackson said, "Hey, are you sure about this?" And the clerk said, "Yeah, I'm sure." And he said, "Hey, take it before I change my mind." So I think that just kind of shows that, he wasn't forced to do this. And the only reason he didn't want to do it to begin with was just because, he didn't want to lose that much money. I'm sure otherwise he would have given it to him. So he was definitely under no obligation. And we even see at the end of the story that he wanted to see kind of Jackson fight for it, maybe not even necessarily the money. So I definitely don't see an obligation on the part of the clerk. And the last question, and I would say what the story is mainly about and kind of tries to figure out, is does Jackson redeem himself at the end of the story? And I would say the answer is yes, and I think in two parts. One that's kind of maybe more obvious, and then one that kind of has maybe more of the deeper meaning to the story. And, with the pawn shop, somebody who stole it or somebody who found it, they pawned it after and never came back to redeem it. And so then in that way it belonged to the pawn shop and the item was unredeemed. And it just kind of so happens that the person who ends up redeeming it is Jackson, the grandson of his grandmother. He ends up coming and redeeming it. So we see kind of how it was an unredeemed item, and how Jackson was able to get it shows that he was kind of able to actually physically redeem the regalia. And that's kind of maybe the more obvious situation. But I think the more deeper meaning and kind of what the story is about is that, he always thinks about his grandmother throughout the story, in her time as a nurse in World War II in Australia, and many other examples throughout the story. But we see that he has this longing for his grandmother. He never really knew her. He kind of always wanted to. He doesn't have very many memories of her. But this is something that he remembers very clearly, very vividly. And I think with him having it, it kind of is a part of him. It's a part of his grandmother, a part that maybe he could never feel or see, but is kind of with him, even though she's not alive to be able to see, for him to be able to see her. And I think that's kind of what the story really highlights there. And when he puts it on and starts dancing, he's not thinking about what other people think about him, or, he kind of understands full well what he's doing. He's redeemed it, and now it's a part of him. His grandmother is with him, even though she's not with them there physically, she's kind of with him there through the regalia. And I think through that way, it kind of shows what the title says, what you pawn, I will redeem. Something that was unredeemed, gone for a very long time, was taken and was finally redeemed by Jackson. And, obviously we don't know how the story ends, but maybe through that, it was a maybe life-changing experience for him. Maybe it helped him move forward and to get on. We don't know. But we see that, it was something that was special for him, and he was able to make it happen. And that's what I saw when I read the story.